that would be great. If you don't want to be part of the recording, it is very easy to not be part of the recording. All you have to do is stay muted. When we get to the audience question and answer period, if you want to be part of the recording, you can let myself or David know, and we will call on you and you can unmute and ask your question into the camera. But the simplest thing is to just put your questions into the chat, ask them there, and David and I will read them out to you and let you know, get your question answered for you. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mauro Guillén, who holds the Zanman Professorship in International Management at the Wharton School and is an award-winning expert on global market trends. His new book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything, is being published on August 25th and has been called a sharp, illuminating, lively, brilliant, and urgent, and a veritable guidebook for the brave new world we are leaving our children. Mauro is joined by Simon Johnson, who is the Ronald Kurtz Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT's Sloan School. A noted economist and economic crisis expert, he is the co-author of Jumpstarting America, How Breakthrough Science Can Revive Economic Growth and the American Dream. Please join me in welcoming them both to Northshire Live.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I guess I'm going to get this started. And welcome everyone. Thank you, Northshire, for organizing this event. And of course, thank you, Simon, for being here with me today. I really look forward to having a conversation with you about Jumpstarting America, because right now, as somebody who lives in this country and like yourself, who migrated to this country, I think we all feel a little bit of apprehension about the future, right? So let me just say as an opening statement here what the book is about, but also what are some of the connections that I see between my concerns in the book and what I interpret as being central concerns to Simon Johnson's book, co-authored with John Gruber on Jumpstarting America. So I think we have three shared concerns, right? One is the middle class. So we both feel the middle class because we understand that at the most fundamental level, advanced societies in the world are built on the middle class, both as an economic actor and also from the point of view of politics, right? In terms of building a democracy. Another point of contact, I think, is the transformational role that technology can play in the society and the economy. Now, in my case, it's the subject of three of my chapters. In Simon's case, it's the whole book about the role that technology and technology policy plays in the economy. And then I think the third and really important point of overlap here is inequality. Inequality as a theme, inequality as something that, well, has characterized society and the economy for a long time, but also as something that fluctuates in terms of its intensity. And that, of course, we are right now at a crossroads because of the pandemic, but also because of some trends that have been going on for quite a bit of time, in the sense that these patterns of inequality have become more intense and have begun to undermine, in fact, some of the most cherished institutions that I think our societies have built over the last 5 decades or 7 decades. So before we begin the conversation, Simon, what I would like just to say is that really my book is about the future, is about what the world might look like in the year 2030, as the title indicates. I'm hoping to persuade the audience today that my only regret after going through the initial months of this pandemic is that instead of titling the book 2030, if I could make the decision today, I would call the book 2027. And the reason for that is that I think that this pandemic, for the most part, accelerates the trends about population, about the evolution of the economy, about the rebalancing in the world between emerging markets and more mature markets. And also, of course, about the many ways in which technology is changing our lives. So that's really my only regret. I hope that, between the two of us, we can get into some of the specifics and some of the details as to how our two books overlap and how do they connect, how do they reinforce, I think, very important messages, I think, at this time for everyone who is concerned about not just the economy, but also the overall evolution of things, especially in the society and in politics. So that's what I would like, to say as an initial statement. I wrote this book because I'm curious about what the world will look like, and because I was sensing that, yes, some of the trends that I describe in the book have been going on for a long time. For example, population aging, or for example, the increasingly important role of women in politics, in the economy, and so on and so forth. But that we're coming to a point at which these trends are reaching critical levels. And so just to mention two quick examples, population aging, yes, has been going on for a long time, but you see, beginning around the year 2030, the age group above the age of 60 is going to be the biggest market segment in the world, right? And that is really, I think, we're going to be very consequential. And in terms of women, I'm also predicting in the book that before we know it, they're going to own more than half of the net worth in the world. And that's also going to have many consequences. So I'll just, I would like to stop there and to bring Simon, my colleague. I consider him a colleague, although we've never been at the same time at the same institution, and bring him into the discussion. And talking about years, because Simon was pulling my leg a little bit about year 2030, the future, this or that. And you also make a big point in your book, actually, Simon, about another year. But it's a year in the past. It's the year 1940. So I'd like to begin the conversation by asking you, why is it so important, the year 1940, to your argument in jumpstarting the economy or jumpstarting America?
Thanks, Mauro. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, Rachel and David. And thanks for that great question, Mauro. I do think one of the things I really liked about your book, Mauro, is that you pushed us to think about what's really different today, what's really changing, as opposed to what may just be accelerating. So when have we seen really big structural breaks in American history, or world history for that matter? Not so very often. I agree with you on that. But 1940, I do think, was such a moment. 1940, 1941 was a time when the US, which had long been a strong engineering country, actually took a very decisive step towards becoming a scientific superpower. It was, of course, the threat of technology, particularly German technology, in the impending World War II, and the way in which the US was able to mobilize existing scientific knowledge and its talent, a lot of which was immigrants, actually, even in those days, apply that to the war effort with radar, with many other technologies across weapons and logistics, and of course with the invention of the atomic bomb. And having done that in 1945, there was a collective realization on the part, let's call them the political and scientific elite, that this was not a one-off, that science was going to be really important to the world and to America's position in the world. And there was a big push to invest in science, to create new scientific knowledge, and to build machinery that would convert new ideas into new products, new companies, new jobs, much of which you look back and you realize that they were sort of accidental. There was no, coherent national strategy. This is the US after all. But actually, there was a lot of reasonable compromise. There was a lot of bipartisan consensus. There was the external threat of the Cold War, of course, and the launch of Sputnik in 1957 was an accelerator, I think, in your terms, Mauro. But that 1940 and 1950s launched us in this phase with a big development of the middle class and a lot of really good jobs being created and a spreading of prosperity that this country, in fact, maybe no country had ever seen before. And of course, it involves other parts of the world as well. I think we've run out of steam in that push, Mauro. And I think that many of the trends that you're elaborating on, I mean, some of them are good, the rise of women, for example. Some of them are unavoidable, the demographics would be included, but the pressure on the middle class and the way that technology plays into that. And I would also venture to suggest some aspects of globalization have played into that too. I think it's time to reevaluate how we got here and to see if we can once again come up with some big, new, decisive policies. I would propose, let's not retreat from science, let's embrace it and let's do more of it. And let's get a better version of the futures that you imagine in the book, Mauro.
Yeah, so I address in my book the stagnation of the middle class, the old middle class, right? So I say, look, what we have is an ongoing battle between middle classes in the world. The jobs are now being created primarily for the new middle classes in emerging markets. And the stagnant middle classes in Europe and the United States, which are essentially third or fourth generation middle classes, are suffering. There's at the same time, a geopolitical competition here for resources and for all sorts of things, but primarily driven by this growth of the middle class, right, in emerging markets. And now, one of the things that I really like about your book is that you say, well, the American middle class has declined precisely at the same time that our investments in R&D, research and development, began to falter, began to decline, right? And in particular, you mentioned public expenditures, right? So for me, right, and I'm a sociologist, you're an economist. For me, what is really the engine of change right now is this competition between an old middle class and a new middle class in the world, with different aspirations, with different cultures behind it, and of course, located in different parts of the world, right? So am I reading your argument correctly when I say that for you, what happens to middle class is actually a dependent variable, is a consequence of other decisions that are being made, particularly regarding technology and technological development, as opposed to the middle classes being, which is what I argue, an engine of change, right? Something that is changing the world. And by the year 2030, they're going to be, essentially giving us a very different reality than the one that we have today because of this dynamic.
Yeah, I think you can have. I think you both aspects of the middle class are true, Mauro. I think that the clearly the arrival of emerging markets, the development of manufacturing around the world, the growth of middle class in India and China, these just as you highlight in the book, and the potential for a middle class in Africa. I think it's one of the most interesting ideas you put out as a potential future. Clearly, that matters and has driven a lot of opportunity for business and a lot of opportunity for trade and of course prosperity. That's what prosperity means around the world. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think just because other countries rise, the US gets squeezed or the US middle class gets squeezed necessarily. But I will absolutely agree and reinforce what you just said, which is in the version that we've experienced since, let's say, 1980, the American middle class has been squeezed, mostly, I would suggest, by technology and the way that we use technology and what that's done to jobs. So the elimination of certain kinds of jobs that were previously safe, middle-class jobs, union jobs, for example. But I would also suggest that globalization and the way that patterns of trade have developed has reinforced that pressure on the middle class that is driven primarily by technology. And what we argue in the book is we should not retreat from technology. I also don't think we should retreat particularly from globalization. But what we should look at is how much do we invest in creating new ideas, new products, new ways of organizing things, and then what kind of jobs do we get in America from that, and then what kinds of goods and services do we sell to the world? That was the post-1940 strategy. And if I could jump to the issue of COVID, for example, which is not going particularly well. I think you noticed that in the United States. If it were the case that if we had made in the past, and we're now making much larger investments in relevant science around the biology, around bioengineering, around diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, I would contend if we had better, stronger basic science and a stronger ability to convert that knowledge into practical products and sell those to ourselves and to the world, I would suggest we'd be in much better shape now than is actually the case. If we have any hope of extricating ourselves from this crisis anytime soon, it's vaccines. I think the administration has gone a little too heavy on a vaccine-only strategy, but there's no question that scientific capability could be a get-out-of-jail card for the American economy. I would propose to invest more in both immediately mobilizable technology from therapeutics and also from diagnostics, and then don't stop. Because respiratory diseases, I think, are the most important enemy that humankind faces in coming decades. So I think we need to double, triple down, quadruple down in terms of that investment, just as we did after 1957 when the Soviets launched a satellite. So there was a rival, there was a threat. Now the threat is much more severe, much more damaging. It's killing people around us. And it's not people. It's a virus. So we need to invest, and we need to adapt, and we need to scale up our scientific enterprise, and we need to mesh that with the world, I would say, Mauro, because in this case in particular, we can only really be much safer if the world is safer with regard to virus, which means spotting the virus, getting ahead of it, helping people with preventive medicine. You know, that's a business model. It's a business model in which we can have a lot of really good middle-class jobs once again.
Yeah, so along those lines, Simon, let me just bring into the discussion something that I explain at length in the book, which is a very important trend in the world for the last several hundred years, but really coming to a head now is the growth of cities. It's only been 10 years since we've had in the world more people living in cities than living in the countryside. At the present time, we have about 55% of the population living in cities. And I mention this because obviously this public health crisis that we're going through, I'm not going to say that it doesn't affect rural areas, which is obviously not true, but it poses some challenges in terms especially of some of the decisions that we've made, for example, remote work, which could have major impacts on certain cities, for example, here in the United States, such as New York, which depends to a very large extent on commuters coming into the city to work and to have fun and to purchase things, in addition, of course, to tourists. Now, I mentioned in my book something that I think is really important for also making a connection to another topic that I wanted to ask you about. I mentioned in the book that cities occupy only 1% of the land in the world. But as just mentioned, they're home to about 55% of the population, and they account for 80% of the carbon emissions, right? So in the book, you discuss several big undertakings, technological undertakings, more recent than the ones dating back to World War II, such as the Human Genome Project. So in my book, I actually, argue that climate change and the fight against climate change, especially as far as cities are concerned, which is where we have the problem really, could provide a catalyst for essentially directing societal and economic efforts in the right direction in terms of, generating new technologies, changing people's behavior, and ultimately ensuring that we will have a future right beyond the year 2030, if you allow me to put it that way. So I was wondering, I pay a lot of attention to this issue in my book, and I also mention many ways in which technology may help us overcome the climate crisis. So in your book, you do not make a big point about this, but could climate change be a catalyst for reshaping the American economy and jumpstarting it? Because that's certainly the way in which I see it in my book, right? Not just for the United States, but for the world as a whole. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very fair point, Mauro. I think that to the extent we can get a consensus around investing in science and technology to decarbonize the economy or to make the economy more efficient with regard to energy usage, for example, I think that would be very helpful on many fronts, including with regard to broader climate change and frankly, technology that we can also sell to the world, which is an important consideration. We did not emphasize that in the book, Mauro, for one very simple reason, which is we were attempting to write a book that could appeal across the political spectrum. And the good news is it has appealed across the political spectrum. There is actually some bipartisan legislation that will take up some of these ideas. That is taking some of the ideas. It just proposed legislation right now, but there is has been a lot of constructive discussion. The energy climate point when we were completing the book 18 months ago was still more controversial, and we're not afraid of controversy at all, but we wanted to focus on the idea of more public investment to catalyze more private sector growth, to create more jobs and rebuild the middle class that route. But I have no objection at all to what you're saying. I would say on the city's point, Mauro, it's really interesting and of course difficult to say the net effects of COVID. I do worry about mass transit. So I think if it's a city in which we walk to work, that's not so bad. Okay, maybe there's issues with elevators, for example. So how tall are our buildings? That's one question. Do we have to share the elevator and so on? People are very aware of that. But I think mass transit, where people are crammed together on trains, people are not going to look at that in the same way again anytime soon. So there may not be one size fits all in terms of the effect on cities. more energy efficient solutions that everyone driving to work would be good. But maybe we don't go to work every day anymore, Mauro. Maybe there's a mix and match. I mean, in the biotech sector in Boston, for example, which was classified as essential and therefore able to work through the whole pandemic, they reduced the number of people who came to the lab. They had 2 shifts, a green shift and a blue shift, and they were not allowed to meet and not allowed to socialize outside. Right? So they have 2 separate zones or pods. And, you know, some of them said they had 30% productivity. Some of them said they had 60 to 70% productivity. I think we're going to have a lot of experimentation and learning about how much you really need to see people in person, as opposed to have highly productive, engaged discussions like the one we're having right now. So we're not going totally remote. You said that in your book. I agree with that. But are we adjusting and going more online, more remote than we were in the past? Again, I think that's one of that's an accelerating factor, just as you were arguing. And I think we're seeing that before our eyes. So how does that affect cities, and how does that affect productivity and productivity growth if we think cities have a beneficial effect? Don't know. The jury's out on that, but it does seem to play into the story you're telling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with you that the 2 extremes, the extreme of working every day of the week at the office, and the other extreme, which is working remotely from home 5 days a week, I think are not likely to be the equilibrium, right? To be the end state here after we overcome the pandemic. I think we're moving in the direction of essentially recognizing that there is a hybrid model or a compromise between the 2 that may actually be better for both the companies or the organizations people work for and the people, the workers themselves, right? Now, one thing that I want to emphasize about this whole business of technology is that one thing is that we have great R&D capabilities and that we come up with amazing breakthroughs, great innovations. And quite another is that, as you very well know, and many of your colleagues at MIT actually study this, that people actually are willing to adopt the technology, right? There's a gap there. And that is a gap that I try to, bridge in my book in the last 3 chapters in terms of what do we know about demographics and changing demographics? What do we know about the way in which people are thinking about the problems that they would like to overcome that may, in the end, lead them to adopt certain technologies? Not every technology gets adopted. Not every technology, even the most amazing ones, get adopted widely. And that's always a question mark. And I wanted to actually go back to 5 minutes ago, Simon, when we were talking about climate change. In your book, you do discuss hydrogen vehicles, right? I understand that it is a better technology, especially in an urban environment, than electric vehicles. But electric vehicles haven't really taken off, right? Maybe they will take off in China, who knows? But certainly here in the United States, not yet, right? So what are the kinds of, besides the technology itself, and besides, of course, the obvious thing that, well, you need the infrastructure, you need places where people can recharge their vehicles and all of that. But what exactly, right, do you think is standing in the way of abandoning the internal combustion engine, which has, essentially been around for over a century now, in favor of some of these other alternatives that seem to be viable? And in fact, people can get a subsidy from the government if they adopt it. But still, we see like incredibly low rates of adoption, right? Do you have a view about that? I'm sure you do.
Well, I think Elon Musk will tell you that Tesla's had a good crisis so far, Mauro.
Yeah, so far.
So it's a very interesting question. Obviously, as an economist, I have to say the price of gasoline, Mauro, plays a role, and the crisis has lowered the price of oil, and so people.
So increase taxes.
Well, I didn't say that. Don't. This is being recorded, so please don't put words in my mouth. No, I think that, and Eddie, the sale, I'm sure you've noticed, everyone's noticed, the sale of very large SUVs and pickup trucks is way up. So I think Americans respond to incentives, Mauro. I do think the performance of electric engines is dramatically improved, and it's not clear to me that people care so much. It has to be internal combustion. They want certain specification. They want certain performance from their engine, and they want a certain kind of vehicle. more than they necessarily want to be emitting fumes or not. And as you say, it's the convenience of, you go to a gas station, there's a you know, a lot of pumps selling gasoline, only a couple of pumps selling diesel in the US. Yeah. Europe, it's quite different, as you know. That's always affected people's willingness to go for diesel vehicles in the US.
Yeah. Now, yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah,
so it's a great question, Mauro. I think that you know, it will shift over time. I think the technology is dramatically improved, but if the price of gasoline remains at current levels, I think people are going to stick with the existing big vehicles, and the manufacturers, of course, are just trying to stay afloat in this difficult situation. So they have less incentive to push people away from the high markup vehicles, which are the very large SUVs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One thing I would add as a sociologist, you know, given the more prominent role that women are playing across the board in business, in politics, in nonprofit organizations, and so on and so forth, is that every bit of evidence that we have about the behavior of women indicates that on average, they tend to be more environmentally conscious than men, right? On average, right? They're also more risk averse. And that means, among other things, of course, that they invest their money in different ways, but also that they think about the future in a different way than men on average, right? I mean, there's a lot of variation within each of the two groups. Now, I argue in my book that this may actually provide a bigger opening in the future in terms of doing the right thing when it comes to the environment and doing the right thing when it comes to the adoption of technologies that, you know, maybe we're used to the old one, but, you know, in that subpopulation, maybe there's going to be more cultural incentives rather than economic incentives for them to explore these technologies. You know, I think incentives are really, really important. But how about nudging? So in my book, I make a big fuss about nudging, which is in principle something that is about the framing of the problem or the situation without really paying people, right, in any way, or penalizing people economically for not doing the right thing. And I take it that in your field in economics, nudging has also become like a really, really respectable theory, and it has even earned a Nobel Prize or a couple of them. So I've been criticized actually for saying that maybe systemic change is not as important, but what's important is individual change. And I believe that nudging can play a very important role in terms of steering us as a society towards, you know, a more environmentally friendly future. So as an economist, of course, you've been emphasizing incentives, but economists are also recognizing the importance of nudging these days. So at the end of the day, I'm curious, since we've known each other for so many years, I mean, what is your thinking about nudging versus incentives, or do we need both?
Well, I think you need both, Mauro. I think the nudging, the contribution of the nudging experts has been amazing and brilliant, and I like the points you make about in your book. I think, you know, in a sense, you can get something free. You can, just by changing how people think about a problem. So what's wrong with that? I do think, though, for something as big as climate change, it may not be enough, right? So, you know, your point about women making decisions is fascinating, and I think only time will tell. You know, consistent with our view, I would say, in addition to those measures, finding ways to make big strategic investments in underlying science and technology that can do what? Well, cheap ways to lower the amount of carbon, decarbonize our economy, right, across the board. Let's look for that, make that a big national priority, and then figure out how to sell that technology to the world. Clean energy is something that they need desperately, as you know, in emerging markets. The levels of air pollution, the problems they have with coal-powered power plants, the concerns that they have about all forms of pollution are even more dramatic than what we have in many parts of the United States. So pushing that, thinking of that as a strategic sector, and looking for the complementarity between the kinds of investment the government makes, because there's a lot of spillovers and a lot of benefits that aren't captured by any one company, but can be captured by an entire sector or an entire country in this case. And then thinking about how do we build companies, where does the capital come from? If the private sector can do it and can build the kind of companies we want, let them get on with it. But if there are barriers or frictions, as we argue in our book, then that's a reasonable thing to consider. Vaccine development would be a perfect example. Okay, just switching back to medical for a moment. Why do we not have enough vaccines for most diseases most of the time? It's not a high margin business, and the benefits of vaccinating people are shared very broadly across society. So you need more public investment in the science that supports super cheap vaccines. I don't think I need to spend much more time on that point these days. It used to be a little more controversial. But I think looking for that in the energy sphere, Mauro, is a very interesting and legitimate thing to do. And thinking about ways that government activities can catalyze those investments. Like the Department of Defense DARPA program has catalyzed a number of high profile, prominent investments, including the one that's making this evening's event possible. Yeah. Right? That came very much from early strategic investments from a defense perspective. So let's get more imaginative. Let's spread that mandate. Let's not proposing the military take over the economy, don't get me wrong, but I'm thinking public investments to catalyze private initiative to achieve social goals. And I think it lines up with what you want to, Mauro.
Oh, no, absolutely. And now, one other thing that I wanted to emphasize about my book is we haven't mentioned a part of the economy that is really important, which is the education sector. Now, of course, in your book, it plays like a really central role, but you, of course, focus quite a bit on higher education and higher education that is research-oriented or that contributes to the creation of capabilities when it comes to research and development. Now, in my book, I emphasize more primary and secondary education, especially when I'm talking about Africa and how the demographic rise of Africa is going to perhaps reshape the world. Over the next 10 years, we're going to see 400 million babies being born in Africa. And I argue in the book that unless we find a way of educating those 400 million people, Africa is not going to be able to really develop. I also mentioned that technology can play a very big role in terms of primary and secondary education. And I actually argue in the book, although I wrote this thing before the pandemic, this particular segment of the book, that online education could help in a place like Africa bridge the gap, right? Between the existing resources, traditional resources for schooling and the others. But I did want to, put on the table for debate, so what is the relative importance of higher education relative to primary and secondary education, especially in a context in which, we are right now in the United States, where we see that many people are being left behind, so the ones who get a college degree, for the most part, they do really well, especially in certain fields. And how much of the stagnation of the middle class is due to the fact that maybe we have neglected primary and secondary education? It's a question. I don't know, what the right answer to it is, or whether we have any good evidence, right, to link it to the stagnation of the middle class in particular.
Well, I think primary and secondary education is more important, Mauro, pretty much across the board. But of course, there has to be a link and a transmission belt from that education to preparation for jobs, and for there being jobs that are going to use the skills that you have. I mean, India has long been considered, India has changed a lot in recent decades, but for a long time it was considered to be a place which had a lot of education relative to the opportunities and relative to the incomes that people could earn. So education is necessary but not sufficient. I think on Africa, you're obviously right that demographically this is going to become a much larger part of the world, just in terms of population. And you're also right that education is a very big gap that's not been closed. And that while mobile phones have spread and there's a different kind of information revolution in Africa, it hasn't cracked the very hard nut of education. But I agree with you that if we get from this something that catalyzes online education and people's ability to climb up through primary and secondary education, that would be amazing and really helpful. Again, not sufficient perhaps. The National Defense Education Act of 1958 in the US, Mauro, features very, very large in our story of post-World War II. This was in the aftermath of Sputnik. The Soviet Union was correctly viewed by the Americans as, and they were right about this point, that they were training a lot of engineers. And the Americans said, we need more engineers. And the way to get more engineers is to reach down into primary and secondary, make sure there's better teaching of math and physics, and scholarships to go to college, for people who have the ability. And they also expanded massively the number of places in tertiary education, in higher education. So I think of that as being part and parcel of the same reaction. And, we emphasize that a major reason to invest in science is not primarily to create more jobs for people with PhDs. It's to create jobs for people who don't have PhDs, who work in the labs, because those are good jobs for good pay, and those jobs don't go overseas, right? You keep the R&D close at home. That's been the pattern, even through the most intense phases of globalization. Much more R&D stays at home than any form of manufacturing, for example.
Absolutely.
Services. So
yeah, and I mentioned in my book also this very important connection here, and I think you also do with immigration, right? And how now that many countries in the world, but especially the United States, is turning against immigration, how that could impair, the future development of this economy and this technology sector. And I also point out, there's very good research indicating, as you know, that whenever a country shuts down immigration, then what you see is companies investing abroad and making use of that talent. And that is starting to happen with R&D, that American firms are investing abroad because it's easier to go there and employ that talent rather than try to bring it here to the United States. And so I think I'm looking at Rachel, and I don't know whether, it's already 8:37. We should probably start going to the audience. Simon and I could just continue talking for hours and hours on end. But Rachel, would you like to jump in and give us some questions from the audience?
Sure, absolutely. And audience, I encourage you to put any questions that you have into the chat, or if you want to be part of the recording for later broadcast on YouTube, you can send me a message and I will ask you to unmute when it's your turn, and we can get you in that way. But I'm actually going to kick things off with a question that my lovely colleague David sent me. He said, Mauro, you mentioned how online learning could transform education in Africa. What do you think education in the United States is going to look like in 2030, especially given the tipping point we're in with education right now?
I think
in mid-September, Mauro. They want to know about mid-September too. So
there you go. Or pass-fail policies. I am of the same mind regarding education as I am of remote work. And we've discussed remote work, meaning that we should seize this opportunity to arrive at a blended education that incorporates technology in a different way, that is not just a substitute for face-to-face instruction, but rather that offers the student a better learning experience. So I hope that that's what we do, during this crisis, and we try to essentially arrive at a better model. I think, there's a huge incentive for doing this, which is that the cost of higher education has gone through the roof. And I don't think it is sustainable. And I guess if it weren't for this pandemic, the next big debt problem that we would have in this country would have been the student debt mountain. Now, of course, we have other preoccupations in mind, but I think every crisis is an opportunity for doing things in a better way. And the same way that I agree with Simon that we should try to innovate in terms of remote work and how we can arrive at some kind of a hybrid or blended approach to work, I think we should do exactly the same thing with education. And speaking for myself, I have been experimenting over the last 8 years. I have classes offered in the most popular learning platforms. And I've been trying to incorporate that into my teaching in the classroom. And I think this is something that can revolutionize primary, secondary, and also higher education. So I have high hopes for that as we go through this experience, both the students and instructors, that we find better ways of providing our students with a learning experience.
Rachel, I've long been a skeptic, actually, of online classes, online teaching. I think certain kinds of knowledge transfer and engagement and development of the mind is much more effective in person. And it's really interesting. I mean, this fits exactly Mauro's themes, that the crisis teaching is forcing us to learn a lot of things. I'm getting better at online teaching. The MBA students definitely want to be there in person. So do kindergarteners. Young children really do need that in-person interaction as much as possible. I think we're all seeing that, and we're all trying to solve that. And of course, the other thing we're figuring out, Rachel, is that the inequality of access to laptops, broadband, but also a physical space where you can work safely and quietly, be on Zoom without danger around you. Those are things that many of us, including myself, take for granted, but that we shouldn't take for granted. And you know, in countries like Korea, South Korea, which have said, right, we're going to provide everyone with the basics for, you know, high-speed internet access in this context, I think they've got an advantage over us because we're letting our existing inequalities, it's as if the virus has spotted and exploited our deepest national defense weakness, Rachel, which is that we're highly unequal. We tolerate massive inequality of everything, including those aspects I talked about, and it's going to exacerbate them, right? This is dangerous, and I think we need to confront it head on.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you both. I've definitely, as a parent of school-age children, I have noticed that my fairly privileged children, whatever goes on with this, they've been fine. You know, has it been easy? No. Has it been great? No, but they're fine. And there are many children who are not. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. There's a great question in the chat from Jeannie. She asks, what link, if any, do you see between improving access to higher education and transitioning to new, cleaner technologies? There are a lot of skilled laborers employed in the old technologies.
Well, Simon, you want to, because I think this is more related to your arguments in your book. I also have an opinion to share, but go ahead.
Well, I think Jeannie's making a very important point that, you know, to the extent that people have jobs in older technologies and are not able to transition to the newer technologies, this is going to be an issue. I mean, what we're recommending, Jeannie, is more investment in the new technologies, faster expansion of those sectors, and support resources to pull people from the old technology sectors. And we have a very conscious and deliberate geographic message in our book, because we think that the pattern of development and opportunities that we've seen in the past 40 or 50 years in the United States has been disproportionately biased towards the coast. So the East Coast and the West Coast have picked up a lot of good jobs, and many other parts of the country have lost jobs, actually lost good middle-class jobs. And so we propose that while pushing forward across a broad front with science and technology, that should be spread much more around the country, and we can identify new hubs or mini hubs that can attract those kinds of jobs. And placing those jobs more broadly across the country, I think, would be a huge advantage. It's a great advantage of the US that we have this size and diversity of geographies, but it would also bring the jobs closer to people who are in some of those older sectors who don't want to move to the coast. And if they did move to the coast, you know, it wouldn't necessarily be to their advantage because it's so expensive to live in the big coastal cities. So I think we need to turn our geographic size back to our advantage, which is what happened in the 19th century and early 20th century.
Absolutely. And building on that, Simon, in my book, I discuss the example of Chattanooga, Tennessee, you know, the city where the song Choo Choo Train, you know, originates from. And so this is in the middle of the country, right? It's not on the coast. And this is a city that industrialized and then suffered immensely, beginning in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, high unemployment, all sorts of problems. And they did over there, I tell this story in the book, exactly what you argue in yours, which is the local government invested in high-speed internet, free for all businesses that would relocate to that city. And this has made a huge difference. Many jobs have been created, jobs that require good skills. And at the same time, the city has enough tax revenue to take care of some of our other displaced workers, as you said, that you know, find themselves at a stage in life in their late 40s, in their 50s, where it's very difficult to retool. So they've also been able to set aside resources to tackle that problem, the problem of displaced workers, right? So I think, you know, I completely agree with you that the geography is really important, that this is not an individual problem. This is a problem that affects entire communities in this country and in other countries as well. And that, you know, the easiest way out of the problem is if there's a commitment from the government and from the civil society in that location to invest, right? To invest in certain kinds of things, including high-tech infrastructure that will attract investment and job creation.
So there's a long but very substantive and thoughtful question from Edward in the chat, who is actually a former guest of ours on Northshire Live. So thank you, Edward, for being here and for the question. He says, The US economy loses $300 billion annually to climate-induced extreme weather events. China invested $360 billion and created 13 million new jobs in clean energy during the past 5 years. Companies representing $36 trillion in revenue have made climate commitments that they believe the future economy is a low-carbon one. It's staggering that a book on jumpstarting the American economy needed to shy away from this because of the political tribalism in this country. Does this suggest that the biggest innovations we need in America are political and cultural and not technological?
Well, that's a good question, Edward. Well put, and I'm delighted that you and Mauro are pushing me in the same direction on this. Look, I think we wrote a book very deliberately to try and advance the political discussion around technology and science and the middle class, and try and put some potential levers, policy levers, make them available, and have people think about how you can use them. And I think we're quite happy with that outcome. I think you're quite right to push in exactly this direction, which is how much money can you make? What's the competition doing? And China is the competition. It's not a zero-sum game, but whoever invents the next wave of technology around clean energy, for example, is going to get the lion's share of the jobs. That's what happened in computer hardware, computer software, satellites, telecoms. Those are all industries we were first in, by the way, and we got most of those jobs, and we still have most of the jobs. The Human Genome Project was a fantastic success in its own narrow, specific terms, but also because it created an industry that employs about 300,000 people now at paying good wages. So, look, if you've got more good ideas for technology specifics and ways we could get ahead, and also I would say to Edward and Mauro, let's be sure we turn general investments into jobs. Okay, show me the jobs. Where are the jobs? Let's not forget Jeannie's question about getting jobs closer to people who want the jobs, who need the jobs, who's whatever, energy intensive, older, more energy intensive part of the economy is going to come under more pressure, irrespective of what we talk about tonight and what we achieve. Let's make those connections. But I'm all in favor. And as soon as you get bipartisan legislation, Mauro, for that one, I'll be strongly supporting it.
Rachel. No, I think this question has been brilliantly answered by Simon.
So we can move on. We have a question from Ellen. She says, in the 50s and 60s, jobs in public education and jobs in public or civil service enabled people to vault into the middle class. But now these positions don't allow people to live middle class lives. Any thoughts or recommendations about how to change this?
Well, look, according to US government statistics, the average income of the middle class in this country, with a few ups and downs, has been stagnant for 40 years. And yes, there's many reasons for that, including those that Simon and John, analyze in their book. There's also the ones that you just pointed out, Helen. I think this is extremely important. If I may, as a sociologist, what I would say is that, something that may surprise you, what I'm about to say, which is that I think the culture of achievement and social mobility that used to characterize the American middle class somehow has lost its dynamism, right? And let me just tell you something that I analyze in the book. You see, when you think about the younger generation now, in their 20s, in their 30s. I'm not going to refer to them as millennials, okay? They're going through a rough time. This is the second economic crisis they're going through during their adult lives. The first one was the 2008, 2009 recession. So very tough for them here in this country. But here's what I want to say, right? When you ask that age group here in the United States, very few of them are interested in having their own home. They prefer to rent, or they prefer to use, in the past, Airbnb and so on and so forth. Very few of them want to own a car, right? And actually, very few of them are interested in getting married or starting a family without getting married, either way, right? So I am an immigrant into this country. I tend to think about the American dream as you become a homeowner, you have your own car, and you start a family. And what's striking to me is that when you look at young people in this country right now, nearly half of them are minorities. And by the year 2030, more than 50% of the younger age group in the United States, in their 20s, in their 30s, are going to be what today we call minorities. Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, and so on. And you know, every survey indicates that these minorities today, right, they actually aspire to being homeowners and to being automobile owners and to starting a family in far greater proportions than the mainstream of the population, right? So it's astonishing to me that some of the most important dynamic aspects, cultural aspects of the middle class in terms of their aspirations, right now in the US, they seem to be more salient, more active, more at play among the minorities than among the mainstream of the population. So in the book, I try to explain what might be some of the consequences of this. The fact that minorities are embracing middle-class values and the American dream so much more than the mainstream. And at the end, I conclude, look, actually the future of this country now and of the middle class hinges, among many other things, including technology development, as Simon was mentioning, or creating good jobs and so on and so forth. It also hinges on whether we actually empower that part of the population, which is going to be more than 50%, or we enable them to have a fruitful life free of discrimination, and so that they can embark on a path where they can achieve as much as they can given their abilities and their hard work. So I want to connect this to that fundamental change that is taking place in the United States. The renewal of the middle class in this country over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years, is going to depend, for the most part, on what happens to those groups that today we call minorities. Because once again, when you think about people in their 20s and their 30s, over the next few years, we're going to see that more than half are going to be in that category. So I'm optimistic because I think they have the right values in terms of seeking to achieve more, aspiring to a better life, and so on and so forth.
If I could just throw a little, I mean, that was really eloquent, Mauro, I completely agree. I just throw a little old school economics on top of that. You know, Ellen, the reason, in the 1950s and 60s, the job market was tight. If you wanted to hire and retain teachers, you needed to pay them a good salary. If you didn't pay them a good salary, they would go off and do something else. What you need is a tighter labor market, and you need more demand for those workers with these kinds of skills, as you're saying, the public sector, civil service. And that's what you're identifying here, and you're completely correct, I believe, is a reflection of the broader hollowing out of opportunities for people with a certain kind of background, a certain kind of skill. And that's broadly across the economy, but you see it reflected in lower real wages and lower living standards for people in the positions that you're identifying. So I think what you want to have is higher productivity. You want to have a higher demand for labor at all levels of skill and training. And you want to make sure that doesn't just get captured by, because, you know, if all the jobs are in 3 cities, the price of real estate in those 3 cities goes up so much, it eats up everyone's wage increases. So we've got a big country, spread the opportunities around, generate more science, more technology, push up productivity, and make sure you pay people fairly. I mean, that's Mauro's point here, absolutely. And then you can get to not back to the 50s and 60s, but you can get to a better outcome in terms of people's ability to share in the unprecedented prosperity that I'm confident this country will create.
Yeah, I fully agree, Simon.
So we have just about 5 minutes left, and I wondered if we could wrap up with both of you telling us, audience members who are, you know, workers, business owners, parents, grandparents, what we can be doing to better prepare ourselves for the world coming in 2030.
Well, or for the future in general. I would say just in 1 minute that I think the single most important thing, especially now that we're in the middle of a pandemic and a worsening economic situation, is we need to think that we're not going to go back there's no way we can reset the clock back to December 2019. This crisis, I don't think, is a reversal of trends. It's an intensification of many trends that were already going on. So if anything, this crisis, I think, should be a reminder that we need to be flexible. We need to be adaptive. We need to essentially ride the wave as opposed to trying to swim against the stream. We need to, take the current, as Shakespeare wrote, borrowing from Simon Johnson's, language. In case you haven't noticed, he's British and I'm Spanish. So you can probably tell from our respective accents, although I believe that now we're both American citizens. So we really want this country to be the best possible one. And we're, speaking for myself, very lucky that I was able to establish my residence and pursue my dreams here. But what I think is important is to really realize, look, you're a small business owner, you're a small person, like I am, you need to change with the times. I don't think going back to the golden age is possible, especially when we see so many things changing in the world so quickly. And that this pandemic is only making this adaptation on our part more urgent, right? That's what I would say in closing.
So to prepare for 2030, Rachel, I have two things for you. First of all, buy Mauro's book. I mean, that is what you wanted me to say, right? The second thing is you don't have to buy my book. I just put a link in the chat. See, this is new stuff we learned. The link in the chat is to the website that goes with the book. It's all free, and we have some very cool interactive maps. Go to your favorite town or set of towns. Look at the criteria that we put up there in terms of their potential to be hubs for technology development and job creation. And get this. You can, this is for Edward or anybody else, you can change the criteria. You can say, well, look, maybe Gruber and Johnson have some general point, but I don't like their specific criteria. You can mix and match and see what it takes to change the rankings of places. And then also, I think you need to tie it to particular sector stories, what exactly is going to get built where and when and so on. So there's an extra level of granularity. But I think that the imagining our futures, Rachel, imagining our futures with more technology, but technology that isn't sort of randomly arriving and destroying another big swath of jobs or enable the another chunk of machinery to be moved overseas. But how about if we have technology where we're actually deliberately saying we want to create more opportunity in more places around the country. We want to address the education problems. Mauro was talking about primary, secondary, connecting that to jobs. We want to make sure people can transition between sectors. We want to push up wages also in the public sector. I think that we get what we imagine. And we have suffered some failures of imagination and failures of policy. I'm a very, very old school economic policy person. I want levers. I want to pull the levers. I want to make sure I know what pulling those levers does. But I think we have failed to imagine what we could do with technology since 1980. In 1940, they imagined it in 1940, and they got it basically right. Maybe they even actually exceeded their expectations. And we need to get back to that. And I think what you need to imagine is prosperity for everyone, without exception, across the country. And yes, we should share that with the world also. But it is entirely within our grasp. And if we don't grasp it, if we don't take those steps, I think we have no one to blame but ourselves. And everyone who doesn't read Mauro's book, I guess we put them in that category right now.
That's a great note to end on. Mauro's book comes out next Tuesday, I believe, or the Tuesday after. You can pre-order it at northshire.com.
Tuesday after.
The Tuesday after, the 25th, it comes out. But you can pre-order it on our website. And Simon's book is out now. It's in both Northshire locations if you're shopping in the stores or available on our website. Thank you, Mauro and Simon, both so much. This was a truly fascinating evening. I could have listened to you talk all night long. But I know we all have places to be. Thank you so much to the audience. It's lovely to see many familiar faces and many new faces. Come on back next week. We have Cree Lefevre being interviewed by Dwight Garner on Tuesday as our next Northshire Live. So hopefully we'll see you all then. Thank you again, Mauro and Simon and everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the internet troubles. Broadband for every access.